Hey there, welcome to Module 17 of the Sattin Hill Farm course. This module is all about basic composting, and before we get into it, it's just to have a huge thanks to our sponsor, PaperPot Co. Without the help of Diego and PaperPot Co., this entire course wouldn't be possible, and more on them later. In this module, I'll be talking about determining your compost needs, time frame, building a compost setup like this here, moisture, inputs, carbon sources, inoculating your compost piles, and finishing the compost. Before we get into all the details about composting, I just want to talk to you for a few moments about determining your compost needs. What do you need to be doing on your farm or on your property? And before we start that, I just want to have a big disclaimer. I am definitely not an expert about composting. I'm definitely not a guru. There are lots of ways to do all of this stuff. I'm just going to kind of show you some of the stuff that I've been doing. And again, part of this is determining your needs. And for me, this is not a huge part of my operation, but it's something that I think is important. And so for me personally, I'll talk about that first and hopefully help you figure out what your needs are for your farm. You know, for me, when I had the farm here originally, most of the waste coming off of the farm and the kitchen scraps and stuff coming out of our home kitchen would get fed to the chickens, but we don't have chickens anymore. So the main motivation for me now is to just process the waste off of the farm. And so that's the biggest thing and the reason why I'm doing it here. Now, for everyone might have different motivations. For some people, might want to be making more compost for your beds. You know, for me, it's, as I said, managing the waste of my farm and keeping that fertility on the farm. So as I crop out beds, you know, there's stuff coming out of the field, that's gonna get compost and it's gonna stay here on the property, which is great. It's also not going to a landfill or anything like that. Now, I've said this plenty of times, for the no-till market garden style that I run here, I don't recommend trying to make your own compost. I can only make a few yards a year probably with this system here. And as I said, to start my farm, I bought 90 yards of compost. I also can't make the same quality of compost that I can buy. And for me to make even decently good compost, it takes a lot of time and effort. And also, if you're trying to produce a lot of scale, you're gonna need a lot of inputs, which is way more than you have on your farm. You're gonna have to be bringing in materials from elsewhere. You need to be able to store that somewhere. You also need equipment to be able to move it. So once you get above a small scale, you're gonna need a front end loader and things like that, and have space to do this. And then you start thinking about runoff and all that stuff. So when you start composting on scale, things change a lot. Also, it takes a lot of time to manage the compost piles, from sourcing the ingredients to getting them on site, to moving them around, to checking piles. That takes a lot of time. And for me, I'm gonna pay a professional to do that. So I usually recommend buying it for most of the stuff that you need in your beds. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't be making compost on your farm. I think everyone should be composting. It's awesome and it's a ton of fun. And again, it's a great way to keep the waste recycled on your property and keep that fertility here. So that's sort of my main objective here with composting, is just managing the waste coming off of my farm. As I just mentioned, there are a lot of ways to make compost, and I'm not about to say one's better than the other. So a lot of people, we usually ask me about, you know, the Johnson Sioux bioreactor, or aerated compost piles, or windrows, or bins, or this and that. Like, this is the way I do it. That's what I'm gonna show you. But in general, I think there's a lot of people that want to rush compost and make it as quickly as possible. Now, for me personally, when you'll see how the system works, is that I don't really stress about that. If it takes a little bit longer, that's fine. For me, you know, the inputs will eventually turn into compost. So if I start this process and it takes a year to make compost, that's fine, because I'm still adding the same amount every month or every couple months. I still get the same output every couple months. So I'm in no rush. That's my system here. Now, some of you might be more eager to get things broken down quicker. That's fine. There's different ways to do this. So, but in general, if you want to make compost faster, right, you want to shorten the composting time, you're going to require more time input. You're going to be breaking down inputs. So if that's shredding materials or breaking things up as much as possible, that'll help speed up the decomposition process. If you're doing short term, you really got to be checking temperatures. You got to be monitoring stuff more often, flipping things, checking the moisture levels, all that kind of stuff. Now, the other thing here is that after the first part of the composting process, where it heats up, we get a lot of worm activity in these bins. And people have asked me all the time, did you inoculate the bins with worm? No, they just show up. So there's no bottoms on these, and after the process cools down quite a bit, the worms find their way in. We get all that vermicompost or vermicast sort of mixed in, so we get a really rich compost. So again, this is a very slow composting process, but it's fine for me because once you get it rolling after 6 to, let's say, 12 months, you always have an output coming out of this system. The system that I have in place here is basically the same system we had at Raleigh City Farm too. These are bins that are made out of pallets and scrap wood, and I'll go through all the features and design and stuff like this in a few minutes. But before we get into that, I just want to talk for a moment about just having an area for composting. I think a lot of people overlook this step, and I think it's crucial to planning out your farm, which I mentioned in much earlier modules in this course, is have a dedicated area for composting, because as soon as you start farming, there's going to be crop residue and waste coming off the farm, and you need to have a plan to manage that, or it's going to get out of control very quickly. So make sure you have a plan for that. Now, you don't need to have bins like this, and of course your scale and what you're doing on your farm will determine like the kind of stuff that you need. So you don't necessarily need to have bins. You can compost on the ground. There are lots of different options. But what I found is that when you have a dedicated compost station like this, it looks much nicer. You don't actually see the material. And because it's a cool setup, it's fun to use, and it makes you want to compost more often. And that can go a long way. When you get excited about making compost, that's a good thing. In addition to having a dedicated setup, I think it's really important to keep it close by to wherever you're going to be pulling crops off the field, wherever is really accessible. If you have to lug all the crop residue and material to an area that's far away, it's not going to happen as much. You're not going to want to do it. Make it convenient and easy, and it'll be awesome to do that. Now, another thing that's important is to have a water source nearby. And so we have a little hose here that we can add moisture whenever we want. So having it near a water source is great, because sometimes you do need to add moisture, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, the number of bins and the size is something else that you're going to need to figure out, and that will be determined by how much waste comes off your farm, how big your farm is, how much you want to be composting, other inputs that you're adding. It all depends. So one thing you want to keep in mind is that usually the pile should be at least a cubic yard to get the temperature up and to get the composting action. So these bins here are, pallets are about 40 inches or so, and so we get about a cubic yard here, so we get the size there. Now for me here, we have 5 bins. I think we could have a couple more, it would be good. And it's never a problem having more bins. I feel like you could never have enough space for composting. No one ever complains about that. So the number of bins gives you that many more times that you can flip it from one bin to the next, and also stage other materials and stuff like that. But if you are doing more material in a year, then you could go with bigger bins. You could have maybe 2 pallets wide or 4 pallets, whatever, or maybe not pallets. Maybe you could build out of some other material. So again, the number of bins and the size of the bins will be determined by how much material you're pushing through. But I would say in general, like 5 to 7 bins or sections would probably be good to give you enough time, and also have space to store finished compost for when you need it. At some point, this kind of system with a structure is not going to work. You're going to have to scale up, which is beyond the scope of what I know and what I do here, but you're going to be using a front end loader, probably using windrows, stuff like that. So this, as I said, this basic composting setup is really for, under an acre for sure. But as I said, you can scale this up by making larger bins, and you can push quite a bit of compost through this system. Now let me give you some details about the compost bins and the setup here. So as I mentioned, we have 5 bins here built out of pallets and scrap wood. And if you're interested in how these are built, I made a detailed video a while back, which I'll leave a link down below in the description, but I'll give you the highlights here. So as I said, they are pallets screwed together, and then on the inside here, we have bits of scrap wood that are just screwed in to keep all the compost in. I know a lot of people want to have, have a lot of air coming in and out. These are fine. These are not completely solid, like air can still move in and out. A lot of people who are really good at composting even have solid walls made out of plywood. So the thing about if you have chicken wire or hardware cloth or something on the outside can dry out pretty easily too, and we're trying to keep moisture in here. So I think you can go either way, but I have not had any issue with it being solid on the walls, the fronts, nothing seals, like air can definitely get in, so I wouldn't really worry about that too much. The scrap wood here are just whatever you can find. We use pieces, we bought a little bit of wood, we used some wood from my old compost setup, so lots of different options there. One big feature about these bins, which is crucial, is the removable slatted fronts. And the way this works is we just have two boards screwed in the end here and another board right behind it here, and then the slats just slide right in. And the thing about this, which is great, is as you're unloading, you can take out a few of the slats, and then when you go to grab your fork, you can get right in there. You don't have to like reach down in, and that makes it a lot more ergonomic. And then before you fill them back up, just drop the slats in, and then you can fill them up. So works really, really well. Another feature here is this cross bracing in the back that runs diagonally. This is instrumental in keeping the rigidity of this setup, because otherwise these just float around and they'll move, especially if one bin is more full than the other. So they're great. The reason why we have it on the left side is that I am a righty, and so as I'm shoveling compost, I'm going to be shoveling it this way because this is the first bin. So we're going to be doing it this way so I'm not getting in the way here. In addition to that, you got to think about moisture, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but what we use here is some black plastic, just a little piece of black plastic over the top of the compost. So yeah, that's basically it. And as I said, the size, you want to shoot for at least a cubic yard in size to really make sure the compost is happy. So again, go check out the video down below if you want more details about this setup. There are several factors in composting to make it happen properly, and first of which is moisture, and we'll get to all the other stuff too, but let's talk about moisture first. Now, the decomposition process or composting, it needs to have some moisture for it to work. The biology needs moisture. Now, if it's completely dry, it's not going to work. If it's soaking wet and soggy, it's not going to work either. So you always want to find that balance. And like with most things in farming, there's no like hard rule. It's like you get some experience, you learn from it, and you get a sense of what works and what doesn't. And especially with composting, when you are adding lots of different things over the course of the year, you're not always building your piles the same way because it depends on your input. So again, this takes experience, learning, and paying attention and getting better over time. So sometimes when you're cropping out, you'll have, plants that are live, and so they'll have a lot of moisture in them, or you have, some fruit like squash or tomatoes or whatever that need to be composted, and they're going to have a lot of moisture in them. So you want to be conscious about when you're building your piles, like what you're putting in there, because if it's all really dry, then you need to add some moisture. But if it's some stuff that could have a lot of moisture in it, you may not have to add so much water or maybe add any at all. When you're flipping the compost from one pile to the next or from one bin to the next, you should be monitoring the moisture and adding some when you need to. And that's why I say it's a really good idea to have a water source right next to your compost station, which we do. It makes it really, really easy to do that. In addition to that, you got to think about the moisture that's in your environment. So here in North Carolina, you guys know that I protect the soil from heavy rains. Same idea with the compost. If it gets too wet, it's not going to be happy. So make sure you're covering your compost bins if you get a lot of rain. Some people go as far as putting even a roof over it to keep the water out, which would be awesome. We probably could benefit from that, but we didn't do that. What we've been using though is, as I mentioned, this little bits of black plastic that we lay down on top of the compost, and that helps quite a bit from getting the moisture to not go into the piles as much, and also keeps the moisture in if we don't have rain for a while. So you'll learn this over time, right? Because if you get a lot of heavy rains, you don't want to be getting this stuff totally soaked. It won't be happy. And if you don't get enough rain, then you might have to add some moisture. So moisture is super important. You'll try to find that balance and get better over time. Let's get on talking about inputs, because inputs are a huge part of composting, obviously. And frankly, what you put in is kind of what you get out, which makes sense. So if you're putting in really basic inputs, your compost, when it's finished, is not going to be very diverse and very complex and not have a whole bunch of nutrients and biological diversity. So what we're trying to do is add diversity into the compost bins to try to create a diverse compost to have a really high quality compost when it's done. Now, the inputs could be lots of different things. You can use things like leaves, grass, you can use wood chips. We'll talk a little about wood chips later because they're a little bit tricky. The big inputs for me are going to be crop residue off the field. So either stuff that I need to crop out or waste or whatever. You could also use spent flowers from around your property or on your farm. And the other one is leaves, and we'll talk about carbon sources later. Household food waste, so we take all the waste out of our kitchen. So we don't compost meat, but everything else from veggie scraps to coffee grounds, eggshells, all that stuff goes in the compost bin with all the other stuff. And that's actually a pretty small amount of the input for the compost. Most of it is going to be stuff off the farm and leaves. But again, that's feels good for me because I know that that food waste is not going to a landfill. It's going to be composted and kept on the property here, which is great. Now, if you're bringing in materials from outside, if you are trying to create more compost than what you generate from the inputs on your farm, or if you're bringing in a carbon source like leaves or whatever, just make sure that you're careful about bringing those sources in and they don't have pesticides on them, because once those things get into your system, they're really hard to get out. So just be conscious about where you're getting your materials from, especially if you're bringing large amounts of anything, because it can wreak havoc once you put that out in your either vegetable beds or your flower beds. So again, think about diversity. The more diverse inputs you put in, the more diverse and better compost you'll have when it's all ready to go. Now let's talk about carbon. And carbon is a huge part of the composting process. And you always want to be conscious about getting enough carbon into your compost, because for me, as I said, the inputs that I'm getting off the farm are going to be crop residue and food waste from our house. That's going to be very high in nitrogen. And you've probably heard this before, but you want to shoot for a ratio of 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. That sounds good in theory, but not everything is just carbon or just nitrogen. So you have to kind of figure that out as you go, and you'll learn this over time and figure out what balance works. And you'll sort of get an idea of like, oh, I put in too much this time, I didn't put in enough this time when I'm mixing with these crops. Again, this takes practice, and again, the inputs are not always the same, so you have to learn and get better at it. For me, the main carbon source that we've been using is leaves, and that's because we're in an area with a lot of deciduous trees, and we can collect a lot of leaves, and they work really well. Leaves are also very nutritious for the soil. They're great. They break down well. They're awesome. You may not be able to get leaves where you are, but there is a lot of municipal operations where you can go get either leaves or leaf compost or whatever, either free or cheap. So that's another thing. Another thing about leaves is that they usually don't have a lot of pesticides and stuff in them. If you're getting lawn clippings and grass clippings and stuff off of people's lawns, people do crazy stuff to their lawns, but leaves, they fall in the fall, of course. And so generally, people don't do a lot of crazy stuff with trees. Generally, leaves are pretty good, but again, make sure you do your due diligence and make sure that the materials you're bringing in are clean. Other than leaves, you could use straw if that's readily available, especially maybe you have some, or someone has some stuff they need to get rid of, or you can get it pretty cheap. Cardboard is also awesome. I know all of us have cardboard all the time because things are always getting delivered. So cardboard's a great carbon source. It's just not nearly as complex and nutritious as leaves are, but again, that could definitely work. Now, wood chips. So you guys know I love wood chips. I use them all around the farm for mulching. You can use wood chips in compost, but they take a really long time to break down, and you'll have to be very conscious about that, because when you eventually get your finished compost, which we'll talk about a little bit later, you might have to screen that out. So you can use wood chips, but I would use it very sparingly. And same thing with sawdust. I wouldn't use a ton of it either, for that reason, that it just takes a long time to break down. So you can use that stuff if you don't have any other options, but it's not my favorite thing. As I said, leaves are definitely my favorite. They break down quickly, they're easy to work with, and everyone wants to get rid of them. So it's kind of a win-win for everybody. So I will talk more about the inputs when we start building a pile. Let me jump in here real quick and take a minute to talk about our sponsor, PaperPot Co. As I mentioned at the beginning of this module, and in every module, this entire course is sponsored by PaperPot Co. I literally could not do this without the help, generosity, and support of Diego and PaperPot Co. Their commitment to the farming community is really unmatched, and you can definitely see this by the awesome tools, equipment, and supplies they have for sale over at PaperPot Co. They have great customer service, and they are a reliable place to buy things from. I definitely recommend that you go check that out. In addition to that, they really support the farming community through education and sponsoring stuff like this. But Diego puts out some great content too, like his podcast, Farm Small, Farm Smart, and Carrot Cash Flow. He's also got some really cool videos on his YouTube channel about some really nerdy composting trials and experiments, so you should definitely go check that out too. In addition to that, there are some extra resources for this course over at paperpot.co/Josh. Now, back to the module. Now, it's always good to inoculate your first compost pile with some good biology. And this could be, you could get this from a lot of different places. Once you get the system rolling, you can just use compost from a pile that's further along to inoculate your first pile, which I'll show you. But when you're first getting started, you could get some active compost from a friend and toss that in there. You could go out into the forest and grab some soil that you think is really healthy. You could even reach down into a pile of wood chips that you might have sitting around, because I always have piles of wood chips sitting around. And if you reach down deep enough, you'll see that it looks like soil. It's dark, it's rich. There's a lot of biology going on there. You could inoculate with that. So Make sure you add some of that into your beds to get it going, and once you get it going, you'll have plenty to then bring back down and mix in with your first pile. Now that we have all the ideas about inputs and moisture and all that stuff, let me show you how I build a basic compost pile. And this is something we do constantly on the farm. Anytime we're cropping out, we just build it as we go. You could have an area where you store materials and then have someone else mix it later. You could teach everyone how to mix it themselves, depending on how many people are at your farm, whatever you feel comfortable with. But I have an empty bin here. We've already moved all the material up to the future bin, so we had room to start a new pile. I don't empty it completely. I always leave a little bit on the ground because there's, as I said, that sort of inoculation compost and everything that's good is already in the ground here, worms, all that stuff. So we're going to build a little bit on here. There's just maybe a few inches left on the ground here. So what I'm going to start with is going to be, I have some squash plants over here that needed to come out. So let me get these in here. So one thing I was saying before is the more that you break things down, the quicker they will break down. But these are pretty good. You know, some things like maybe the base of kale, something like that might be, you know, you might have to break down a little bit more things that have thicker stems. But as I said, this is this breaks down pretty quickly. So we got a couple kale plants in here. The more you layer it, the better. So, you know, you don't put like a whole thing of squash plants and then put a couple layers. Like the more you layer it, the better. If you have to throw in some fruit or some larger stuff, as I said, if you break stuff down a little bit, it will help break down the process a little bit. So here's some extra squash. These are kind of big anyway, so I'm just breaking them open just so that they'll break down faster. So as I said, this takes time, this kind of stuff, but you know, the more time that you spend breaking down materials and all that stuff will help things happen faster. So it's just a matter of what your goals are. So we'll throw a couple more in here, but as I said, just to show you that, you know, any of the crop residue that's coming off the farm. And then what I'll do, I'm not gonna add any moisture to this because this obviously has a lot of moisture in it, in the fruit, and the plants were just alive, so there's some water in there. Gonna add some leaves. So as I said, I'm not going too thick with my layers. I'd rather have more layers. And then I have some somewhat finished compost that I got from bin number 4. So I'm just gonna sprinkle some of this in there just to sort of inoculate this and get it going quicker. And I'm just gonna add a little bit of water, but not much, because this is a little bit moist, what I just added, and also the plants and the fruit was pretty moist too. So as I said, keep in mind what the inputs are and how much moisture. But the leaves were completely dry. So as I said, that really didn't need very much. I would probably do a few more layers before I put this down, but for the demonstration purposes, when the pile was done for the day, I'll put the plastic on it. And again, this keeps moisture in and also rain out and helps warm it up a little bit too. And sometimes keeps animals and stuff from getting there. But again, you can add food waste to this. When you first build your piles, build them up as high as you can because they will break down and it'll shrink pretty quickly. So again, this is just a quick way of building a pile. More layers are better. Just be careful about the moisture and make sure you get enough carbon in there, and things will break down and actually heat up pretty quickly. So this is the last bin in the line, and this is basically finished compost, but you know, what I want to show you here is kind of where we're at. I don't remember the timing on this. We've made a lot of compost here. I've also pulled quite a bit out of here, so I don't remember how long this has been in here for, but as I said, my process is a slow composting process, so it doesn't really matter when it's done. If it sits here a little bit longer, there'll be more warm action in it, and it'll just break down a little bit more. So let me show you what's going on here. First of all, you can see that the color's nice. It looks really rich, but there's also quite a bit of like chunkiness in it. There's like sticks and stuff, which is actually totally fine. But what I want to point out here is that you get this nice, rich soil, and this is what we're after. There's a lot of diversity. This is fantastic. So this is what we made on the farm here. But depending on what you need, you might have to do some stuff with this compost. So depending on how you're going to be using this compost will determine if you need to do anything else to finish the compost. So if you are putting this in beds where you're going to be direct seeding, or maybe you're using this as a potting mix or part of a potting mix, and you want a much finer consistency, then you might have to do some more work to it. If this is going out into garden beds that you're transplanting into, you might be able to just use this and it would be fine. Or maybe just take out some of the bigger pieces. It really depends on what you need. So if you, as I said, want a finer mix, what you can do, or if you're, again, maybe a little bit anxious to get some of the material out, you can screen it. And there's a few ways to do this. One is just using a basic hand screener, which you could build out of like a frame with a chicken wire or hardware cloth, and you can just put over a wheelbarrow and push the compost over. Maybe you've done that for potting mix before if you tried to, get some of the chunky bits out. If you've gotten some chunkier potting mix, that's an option. Another great way is to use a trommel. And so I made a whole video about this with Gene over at Raleigh City Farm. He's got a great system that's a cement mixer with a garbage can and a screen in it, and it works really, really well. And I will leave that video link down below for you to check out as well if you want all the details. It's something that is not necessary, but again, if you're looking for a certain kind of compost size, that's probably the quickest way to do it, and it's pretty cheap and easy to do. So as I said before, if you are trying to get material out of here a little bit earlier, you can just screen it and then take all the bits that you get out, all the woody bits, and then throw those back in an earlier bin, and that will inoculate those bins and keep breaking down and keep the cycle going. So again, there's a lot of options out there. The reason you screen it is just because of what you're trying to get. Now, if you're trying to go after like what commercial compost usually is, you're gonna have to screen it or use a trommel. They have large sifting machines and screens, and that's how you get the compost a certain size. But as I said, this looks awesome. This is fantastic. This is very rich, and this is kind of what you're going for. Another application for this is trying to extract some of the biology, so you can make teas and slurries and stuff like that out of the compost, and then apply that to your beds or as a foliar spray. So again, that's beyond the scope of this video, but there's a lot of uses for the compost. But for me personally, the biggest thing, as I said before, was just as waste management. So all the stuff on the farm is turning into soil that we can use for lots of different things. I want to say a couple things about temperature. So we do have a long thermometer that we stick in the piles every once in a while to check them, mainly out of curiosity. As I said, this is a long-term composting situation. I'm not trying to rush this. I'm not trying to put a lot of time and labor and energy into managing this. If you are trying to get things done quicker, as I said, there will be more inputs in terms of time and labor and energy and those sorts of things. One thing about temperature though is if you are using the compost in a certified organic situation, then you'll need to be able to get the pile hot enough and document it and record it and be able to show that that happened. So you need to get the pile up between 131 and 170 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 days. So keep that in mind for certified organic. Remember, there'll be live Q&As for the next few sessions. They'll be every Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern, and the next module, module 18, will be all about the wash pack station. Hope to see you there.